Welcome to this second lecture of week 10 of Soil Science and Technology, and in this lecture we will be starting from the slide where we left in our last slide in our last lecture. And in our last lecture we talked about different methods for cleaning or remediating the organic pollutants from the soil, and in this lecture we will try to finish this topic, and then we will start a new topic of inorganic pollution in the soil. So guys, we started with different types of remediation technologies. We started with different physical and chemical methods, and then we talked about different bioremediation technique, and then bioremediation, remember, it is mediated by biological organisms, either microbes or plants. When it is mediated by plants, we call it phytoremediation, and this bioremediation is of mainly two types. One is natural, another is enhanced or engineered. Natural attenuation, basically we do not enhance or we do not modify the environment of indigenous microorganisms. However, in case of enhanced or engineered bioremediation, we modify the ecosystem of the local ecosystem of or environment of the microorganisms. These are mainly, we talked about two types of enhanced bioremediation. One is bioaugmentation, another is biostimulation, and so we talked about the differences, and we talked about this, how this oil spill cleanup takes place. So I hope you got a basic idea about this bioremediation, and we'll be also discussing that later on. So let us go ahead and see what is in situ bioremediation technique, and a snapshot of in situ bioremediation technique can be found in this slide. And you can see in oxygen depleted soil, oxygen is pumped and methane is provided as a carbon source. We are introducing the oxygen from outside, as well as we are also introducing methane as a to provide as a carbon source. And so you can see here, this is the vadose zone and this is the saturated zone, and obviously this is the water table. So when we are injecting the nitrogen, phosphorus in terms of fertilizer, as well as methane as the carbon source, and oxygen through this channel, and ultimately it goes nutrients and other co-metabolites added, and you can see here this is a zone of contamination, and this contamination basically occurs from this from this industrial process, and ultimately these NP, methane and oxygen ultimately enhance the microbial breakdown of the contaminants here, and these breakdown of the contaminants through microbial activity in the in situ. That means we are not excavating the soil and transporting the soil to any other area. Here we are using the in situ indigenous in situ process, and you can see the microbes which are present here breaking down the contaminants, and ultimately the contaminated soil air removed and the volatile contaminants scrubbed from enhanced exhaust air. So this is an example of how this in situ bioremediation can help in remediating contaminated soils. And remember that coarse texture sandy soils are easy to remediate than fine texture clay soil, because of easy of water movement through these sandy soils, and easy of movement of air and water through these sandy soils. So let us talk about a brief in phytoremediation. Obviously, the phytoremediation is the use of plant to eliminate or degrade pollutants, and phytostabilization is when the plant stabilize the pollutants and prevent it from ready movement. So it is a term, phytostabilization, and the mechanism of phytostabilization are basically four types. and the plants, either these plants prevent the wind and water erosion of contaminants, and then leaching is reduced. Third is the contaminant is precipitated in the root zone, and fourth is the contaminant is sequestered in the root zone. So remember that the pollutant does not leave the soil, it is only stabilized. So these are the four ways through which this phytostabilization takes place. And hyper accumulation is another important term. Obviously we will be discussing these in details when we will be talking about the remediation of inorganic pollutants from the environment, but let us in this lecture let us only focus on this term. So hyper accumulation is basically accumulation of usually high concentration of contaminants in above ground plant tissue, and these plants are especially selected for these purposes. And the contaminants can either be eliminated by harvesting the plant tissue, or they are broken down inside the plants into non-toxic secondary products. So again, this hyper accumulation is basically terms, the name itself says is a hyper accumulation, that means enhanced accumulation. It is a high concentration of contaminants in the above ground plant tissue, and these plants are specifically selected for this type of hyper accumulation. And ultimately when this hyper accumulation takes place, these highly contaminated ground tissues, above ground tissues, can be harvested, or they are broken down inside the plants into non-toxic secondary products. So this is how these hyper accumulators basically work. We will discuss in details about these hyper accumulators when we are discussing the heavy metal phytoremediation in our coming lectures of week 10. So let us see what is the enhanced rhizosphere phytodegradation. You can see here in this picture, obviously the hyperaccumulator phytoremediation. You can see this is a plant, and this is an uptake of nutrients, uptake of metals or organic pollutants through these roots. So ultimately accumulation of metals or metabolism of organics here. So this is an hyper accumulator plants, and ultimately if you remove this total biomass, the total heavy metals which are hyper accumulated in the body parts or in the dry tissues will be removed. And obviously this movement of uptake of metals and organic pollutants will be enhanced by addition of chelating agents. So another is enhanced rhizosphere phytoremediation, and obviously you can see translocation of plant compounds to rhizosphere. So enhanced breakdown of organics in rhizosphere, and organic contaminants move into the rhizosphere with water, and ultimately it it shows the enhanced rhizosphere phytoremediation. So in this case basically translocation of plant compounds into rhizosphere, and this enhanced breakdown of organics happen in the rhizosphere zone. And the plant roots excrete microbial substrate and growth regulators, which enhances the activity of the rhizosphere bacteria to degrade the the different types of organic pollutants. So if we talk about again phytoremediation, phytoremediation is advantageous where a large area is contaminated to shallow depth with moderate amount of pollutants, and it is less expensive, it is less disturbance to creates less disturbance to soil, and it takes longer time to remove the contaminants. So this is one of the problem of phytoremediation, it takes longer time to remediate the contaminants. So guys, let us see the last topic of this the last important point of this first topic, that is the effect of aging on bioavailability of chemicals in the soil. If you can see the graph here, it says that although the concentration of a particular xenobiotic compound is higher after a certain period of time, the biological activity gets lowered down, further lowered down. In other words, bioavailability of the contaminants to the degradation decreases with time, and even though their concentration in soil remain high, and these happen as the contaminants get trapped in the nanopores, and contaminants are absorbed into the humus, or contaminants get buried under the precipitate mineral coating. So, you can see here, as the time goes on, after a certain period of time, although the concentration of the contaminants high, the biological activity is low. So, the bioavailability of these contaminants basically decrease with the time. So, there are a couple of ways, there are a couple of reasons. You can see the contaminants are these are basically organic contaminant molecules, and these organic contaminant molecules either absorbed in the soil humus, you can see here, or they can trapped into these nanopores, or either the contaminants gets buried under precipitated mineral coatings. So, these are these, you can see this is a precipitated iron coating, the red shape, and this is buried under these precipitated iron coating. So, there are three methods. The first method is trapped into the nanopores, and then absorbed in the humus, and then finally it is precipitated iron buried under the precipitated iron coating. So, this is how this reduction in bioavailability of the contaminants to degradation occurs with time. So, guys, we have covered this first topic of this week 10 lectures. So, you have got a basic idea about how different methods are how different methods act to remove the organic pollutants from the soil, and we will be discussing these phytoremediation techniques in details in our coming lectures. And let us go ahead and okay, one more thing I want to mention, that this all this process make the contaminant less prone to environmental risk. These aging process and this trapping of organic molecules inside the nanopores, as well as trapping of these molecules or burying of the molecules beneath these iron coatings, on all these processes make the contaminant less prone to environmental risk, and bioavailability should be taken into consideration before taking remediation activities, and removal of contaminants should be based on the bioavailability rather than its total concentration. So, bioavailability is a very important term, and you should consider all the aspects regarding bioavailability while taking a decision of bioremediation or remediating the organic pollutants. So, let us move ahead and see the talk about our next topic, that is soil contamination with toxic inorganic substances. So, guys, the soil contamination not only occurs through organic pollutants, it also occurs through different inorganic substances like heavy metals, and we will be discussing those in this topic. So, the concepts which we will cover are basically what are the toxic inorganic substances, and then what are the sources of these pollutants, and then how they accumulate into the soil, and we will talk about some important toxic metals, and finally some toxic metals in sewage and sludge. So, what are the toxic inorganic substances in the soil? So, toxicity of inorganic contaminants released into the environment every year is now estimated to exceed that from organic and radioactive sources combined. So, inorganic contaminants inorganic contaminants shares a huge portion of the total contaminant which released each and every year in the environment. A fair share of this inorganic substance ends up in contaminating the soils, and the greatest problem most likely involves with these metals, mercury, cadmium, lead, arsenic, nickel, copper, zinc, chromium, molybdenum, manganese, selenium, fluorine and boron. So, all these are responsible for environmental or in other words soil pollution, and each of them are producing the potential health hazards. So, to a greater or lesser degree, all of these elements are toxic to human and other elements. So you can see the water, how these toxic inorganic substances in the soil moves in the environment. So obviously there are different sources like industrial sources, urban sources. You can see the sediments are coming from different wastewater treatment pumps, and this industrial heavy, the heavy metals are coming from the industrial effluents, as well as they are coming from different urban wastewater, as well as other sources. Heavy metals are also coming through mining discharge, and also different types of agricultural agricultural runoff also. So all these are coming through different sources, and ultimately you can see inside the water body there is, they are undergoing different types of, these heavy metals are undergoing different types of biological and chemical transformations, and ultimately leading into the attachment and release from the sediments. So and settling into the settling into the sediment, and further resuspension and storage in the stream bed, and then it again gain uptake by different types of microorganisms, and sometimes this heavy metal get volatilized. So these are some of the ways through which these toxic inorganic substances move from soil to water, and then ultimately get stored in the stream bed, and also settle down at the below of any in any stream or water bodies. So this is very important. Now if we see what are the different types of chemicals or inorganic substances which are responsible for this heavy metal pollution, obviously these are the, this shows the list, and obviously arsenic, cadmium, chromium, copper, lead, mercury, nickel, selenium and zinc, all these are highly toxic pollutants, and there are major sources. For example, in case of arsenic, pesticide, plant desiccants, animal feed additives, coal and petroleum, mine tailings, detergents and irrigation water are the major sources of arsenic. And organisms principally harmed are human, and then animals, then fish, then birds. So all these are adversely affected by this arsenic, and ultimately human health effects, you can see cumulative poisons, cancers and skin lesions are some human health effects of this arsenic pollution. Cadmium also coming from, it's also have important pollutant of soil, and this cadmium comes from electroplating, pigments, then plastic stabilizers, batteries and phosphate fertilizers, and you can see they contaminate all of the they are human, and then animals, and then fish, then bird and plants, and they can cause heart and kidney disease and bone embrittlement. In case of chromium, it basically comes from stainless steel, chrome plated metals, pigments, refractory brake manufacture and leather tanning, and you can see except plants, it can also harm this human, animal, fish and bird. And human health effects, it produce the mutagenic effect, and also remember that it is also acts as an essential nutrient. So these are some of the important, this table basically shows the snapshot of important inorganic soil pollutants and how they affect, what are their sources and what are their positive harmful human health effects. So how they could accumulate in the soil? Obviously some of these toxic metals are being released to the environment in increasing amount, and the inorganic toxins do not decompose and degrade, rather they usually remain into the soil and so accumulate from year to year. In many places the metal contamination is historical, resulting from polluting activities that are no longer practiced. So if you can see this chart, this shows the history of copper, lead and zinc contamination of the soil in central Moscow, Russia, and the some of the trends you can see here in the X, this is basically different different constant different depths of soil. So it is a surface soil 0 to 25 centimeter, then 25 to 70 centimeter, all the way up to 195 to 200 centimeter or 220 centimeter. And these dotted lines are shows the background levels of this lead, this copper and zinc. And as you can see, in 1500 obviously the zinc concentration was quite high, and which ultimately depleted in 1600, and so on and so forth in 1800. And then again we saw a major increase in zinc concentration due to industrial activities. And also for lead also you can see the same, in case of lead obviously in the in case of lead obviously in the in these 1500s obviously there is less concentration of leads. However, in 1600 there is an increase of lead concentration, and ultimately the total the final in 1900 to 1940 due to industrial process there is a several folds increase in zinc concentration. And in case of copper, concentration is greatest in the oldest copper concentration is greatest in the oldest layers because of ancient artisanal metal working. You can see copper concentration was higher in the oldest layers because of artisanal metal working practiced in the ancient period, and ultimately it get reduced. So this shows the total metal concentration scenario, or how they get accumulate historically in the soil. So how they get concentrated in the living tissues. So irrespective of their sources, people everywhere are exposed to these toxic elements every day, either through the air or through ingestion of food, water and soil. And toxic metals can can and do reach the soil by direct or indirect deposits, and from there they become a part of the food chain, and this movement basically occurs from soil to plant and plant to animal and animal to human. Unfortunately, once the element becomes part of the cycle, they may accumulate in animal and human body tissues to toxic levels. So this slide shows the sources and cycling of toxic metals. As you can see here, so obviously these are the sources like industrial products, burn fuel, fertilizers and pesticides, and also rocks in the earth crust. From there these pesticides can occur and fertilizers can occur, and obvious. So basically the major sources are these two, and they are basically mixed with water. So these rocks in earth crust you can mixed with water, and these industrial products, burn fuels, fertilizer, pesticide, they can come directly into the air. And obviously from air you can get it, this can be accumulated in the birds, it can be accumulated in humans. From air it can deposit in the soil, from which plant can uptake, and from plants to domestic animals and further humans, and from soil to water, and from water to plants and domestic animals and humans. So you can see that that the content of metal in organism tissue generally builds up from left to right. As we grow from left to right, the concentration of the metals in the organism tissue generally builds up, and indicating the vulnerability of the humans, because you see we are at the final the humans are the secondary and tertiary food web consumers. So because we are eating both the secondary as well as tertiary food web consumers to heavy metal, and we are much more exposed to heavy metal toxicity, and we have to note that air, water and soil may also be directly ingested by humans. So that's why these heavy metals get accumulated in our body and ultimately results in different signs and toxicity on human health hazards. So you can see here one example of how these toxic metals affect different accumulates within within some agricultural products. Obviously, so this is a vegetable or carrot which was grown in the vicinity of this fence, and in the fence actually they have coated some arsenic containing paints. So this due to the presence of this arsenic containing paints, the adjacent soil get contaminated. So there is a study where they have applied the compost as well as also phosphate, and they can see and you can see that the arsenic consumed within, or arsenic accumulation within the control vegetable. That means when we didn't apply any there are two types of vegetables you can see. One is carrot, another is lettuce. So in all the three conditions, when we are applying no fertilizer or in the control condition, obviously there is an increase in that shows some accumulation of arsenic within these, both of these, carrot and lettuce. However, when we are adding the compost, due to the binding action of organic matter, the accumulation is very less within both carrot and lettuce. However, when we are adding the phosphate, it get enhanced, because arsenic can make certain compounds with the phosphorus. So that shows that how these elements gets accumulated within different plants and plant parts. So let us talk about some inorganic contaminants and their reaction in the soil. Let us first talk with our start with arsenic, because this is a major heavy metal which is creating pollution, especially in India as well as in Bangladesh and Southeast Asia. So arsenic problem in its accumulation in certain orchard soil following the years of application of arsenic containing pesticides, and being present in an anionic form, you can see this element is absorbed and as a phosphates by hydrous iron and aluminum oxides, especially in acid soils. And in spite of the capacity of most soil to tie up the arsenate, long term addition of arsenical sprays can lead to toxicities for sensitive plants and earthworms, and the arsenic toxicity can be reduced by application of sulfate, by application of sulfates of zinc and iron and aluminum, which tie up with arsenic in the in insoluble forms. So you can see this shows the groundwater arsenic contamination scenario of West Bengal state of India. So you can see these zones are very these zones, these red zones and yellow zones shows high accumulation of arsenic, and that's why it is its contamination is very prevalent in this region. And you can see some of the toxic health effects, and ultimately it goes towards deleterious health effect, and ultimately it produces the carcinogenic effects on the plant body. So guys, we have let us stop here, and then we'll be completing the other heavy metals in our next lecture, and we'll try to discussing several other methods to remediate these heavy metals in our next lectures. So I hope that you have learned something, and in the next lecture we'll be discussing some of the other important potential health hazards which potential health hazards from different other heavy metals, and how to remediate those heavy metals from the soil environment. Thank you very much.